The Skin Bandits. Rook only encountered these nightmarish skeletons briefly when traveling to and from the Ashlands for the first time long ago. Malfunctioning robots, mockeries of man, capturing and torturing helpless victims to peel skin off of them and sew them into so-called skin suits. They weren't necessarily a threat to the anti-slavers, but they were a threat to any human that was unfortunate enough to get close to their wretched domain. They were passive towards Rook and his men at first, but he knew this was because they were admiring their flesh, biding their time for an ambush. But before the deranged skeletons had a chance, Rook ordered everyone to attack. To a regular tech hunter or group of adventurers wandering into this area, a group of skin bandits would be overwhelming, but they were no match for the liberators as they cut them down, crushing their rusted frames with heavy armaments. After taking every one of them out, Rook confirmed a hunch by going inside the neighboring storm shack. There was another group of skin bandits waiting inside, unaware of the fighting that just unfolded in the other building. Before they could wise up and go on the offense, Rook provoked them and ran outside where the rest of his men were waiting to help. Rook suspected every house in this strange settlement would be filled with more groups of skin bandits. As long as they can prevent them from rallying a charge, his men would be able to overwhelm them and destroy the space. The skin bandits were tough fighters and shockingly sturdy. Their weapons weren't actually enough to kill the machines, only causing them to go into a temporary reboot stage. To ensure they never reboot again, Rook found the CPU unit in their head and unplugged it, assassinating each of them one by one. Rook ordered the samurai to check the other buildings so they could divide and conquer. More waited inside, and the deadly dance was repeated. This finally caused the skin bandits to become hostile with the liberators. They would attack on sight moving forward, so they had to be on high alert. It didn't take long, but they killed off the remaining skin bandits in that outpost and they continued forward, meeting up with the rest of the men outside of the skin bandits' homeland. Rook filled the rest of the men in on the situation and let them know that they were going to invade and attack the skin bandits, putting an end to their threat. That night, they entered Sonorous Dark, the desolate land where the skin bandits' outposts were scattered. It was a treacherous area that Rook wasn't fully prepared for due to the occasional downpour of acid rain. Only the human samurai had full protection from acid rain with their gear. They would have to tread carefully. They continued to move as quickly as they could to the first outpost until they saw it in the distance. The men were anxious but ready for any enemy, even if they weren't fully prepared for the weather. Nobody was outside when they arrived. A trap? Rook peeked inside a building, causing a group of angry skin bandits to bolt towards him. Rook immediately turned and ran outside while his reinforcements poured into the building, roaring with strength and vigor. The fighting was hectic and claustrophobic in the tight indoors, but they were able to overpower the skin bandits while taking minimal damage. When the fighting was over, Rook ordered for the CPU of every one of them to be unplugged, and then they charged into the next building, the numbers of their enemies feeling infinite. It was the same song and dance for the final building. As the samurai were cleaning things up, Rook proceeded to go in alone. It wasn't long until the rest of the men joined him and the last rust buckets had their cores torn from their skulls. This outpost, this skin house as it was called, was confirmed to have no survivors remaining. Another skin house wasn't much further away northbound, but the acid rain was pouring down hard now. Because of this, Rook ordered all of his men that weren't equipped to handle the acid rain to stay behind while everyone else marched. Rook was worried that his spontaneous command to give the skin bandits no quarter was a mistake. They didn't have sufficient rations prepared for this long of a journey and they were out of supplies. Regardless, he led the group of samurai with him to the other skin house ready to fight. The fatigue was even getting to Rook though. As he entered, he was overwhelmed and bludgeoned unconscious by bandits before the rest of the men arrived. Tal saw one of them scooping Rook's unconscious body up and taking him upstairs where they immediately placed him into some tribalistic torture device. Fortunately, being skinned alive was a fast way to wake Rook back up. Good thing Rook is so good at breaking out as well as breaking in. Rook was in searing pain as the peelers were starting to dig into his armored clothing, but he was able to concentrate and focus on freeing himself while Tao kept the beast busy. Rook busted loose as the soldiers flowed upstairs. It was too close for comfort, but they had to clear out the other two buildings, so they unplugged every machine immediately. Rook was more careful not to enter alone this time, and as a group, the liberators destroyed the skin bandits inside. The group was terminated like the others, and they moved into the final building. Another one of their skin houses was destroyed. The acid rain gave way to less fatal precipitation, allowing the liberators to regroup. Rook suspected there was probably a main base of operations hidden somewhere too, but for now, the liberators were too famished to fight more. If they continued at this rate, they would starve to death or be left for dead in hostile territory. The skin bandits' days were numbered, but for now, they had to return to Morn to resupply. They moved quickly, and by the time they made it back to Morn, they were starving. The bone fields had lots of wild game and they hunted bone dogs and beak things, but they had to cook it before they could eat. They entered their small base of operations and rested up from the fighting. While the men took shifts healing their wounds, Jinsei was trying to make the mediocre food feel like home. When the meat was prepared, the men rushed into it and ate as much as they could. Even then, it wasn't enough for so many soldiers. Morn was poor and so much of the population was killed off by the elder beak thing, there wasn't enough food for sale. The only option was to fall back to New Raleigh, where they would resupply and march east once again. They left the outpost and said goodbye to the people of Morin as they marched out through the gate. Finally, towards home. Rook didn't want to stop their momentum, but at this point, they didn't really have any other choice. He took comfort in knowing that they annihilated a chunk of the bandits' outposts. By the time Rook arrived at the gate of New Raleigh, he felt like he was going to starve. He could barely trot inside. They would take a day to feast and celebrate, and then they would be able to take out the skin bandits once and for all. Time passed quickly, too quickly, and it was time for them to march off. They said their goodbyes to their friends and got into their formation. Rook didn't know when they would return home again. They slowly left New Raleigh, but this time they packed much more thoroughly. They marched hard and fast until they arrived again at Sonorous Dark. As soon as they entered the area, the rain quickly turned acidic once more. Because of this, Rook ordered anyone who was vulnerable to the acid rain to fall back and wait for them by an abandoned outpost. This was painfully familiar, but the men complied with their orders. Nearby, there was a mountainous formation that was hiding a large base. Rook ordered his runners to stay back and hide while he led the heavy footmen inside. This was much larger than the other skin houses. It had to be their main base. As they marched to the entrance, they saw dozens of patrols. The Liberators charged in and the skin bandits immediately greeted them with their weapons. The first patrol, beaten without trouble. Rook entered the closest building and was baffled when confronted not by a skin bandit, but by a human fighter. Lord Savant was seated at a throne. Completely silent, he stood and angled a long blade at Rook. Then, he stepped forth. Was he the leader of the skin bandits? Rook smashed his falling sun into Savant, and once the fighting began, a swarm of skin bandits ran down the ramp to assist, but Rook's men let him keep it a fair fight. Rook's strength and sturdiness won out quickly. While the fighting continued and Savant lay on the ground, Rook dug through his belongings. He found charcoal sketch blueprints, how to make skin peelers. He didn't waste any more time and moved into the next building. The others charged in shortly after, and like every other time, their combined forces laid to waste to the skin bandits inside. The Liberators had found a rhythm. It was finally quiet. The fighting ended and the men ensured that the plug was pulled on every skin bandit, shutting them down permanently. When they surveyed the headquarters, it appeared that there was not one skeleton left. There was just one final problem. Rook met with Tao in private, who was shouldering Savant.
Rook, what do you want me to do with him? You know as well as I do that he's too dangerous to be left free.
Right, but there aren't any pending bounties for him either. I don't think anyone knows about his existence other than the United Cities.
I might as well say what we're both thinking. The solution's right here.
You want me to peel him? Tao, have you lost your mind?
What do you expect us to do then, Rook? Give him to a slaver for a few thousand cats? No one would ever believe that he's a warlord. Listen, I don't like this either, but the way I see things right now, there's no other way. I know you don't like having this kind of blood on your hands, but the alternative is to risk more of those skin bandits to rise up. For this man, this thing, it's a kindness. You go. Rally up the men and I'll take care of this.
No, Tao, you don't have to do this.
This is my decision. Let me take care of it. Let me take some of the burden of this war off your shoulders.
Okay. Thank you, Tao. I'll meet you outside. Once Rook left, Tao placed Savant into the peeler and powered on the machine. Savant was completely quiet up to this point, and as it started to grind into him, he left out screams of pain. Tao took a moment to look over Savant. All he deserved was some spit on the ground. Savant suffered the same fate as hundreds of nameless victims before him, and was left to die alone in a peeler made from his own design. Tao cut up to Rook, and as they were leaving the top skin house, they caught a final patrol of skin bandits that were heading back to their home base, cut off by the Liberators. From the look of things, there weren't any skin bandits left after this group, and any stragglers who were missed were without a leader that could organize them. The skin bandits wouldn't be a threat anymore. Rook's forces obliterated them, and now they could focus on the next threat, the Reavers. They went back to the abandoned outpost where the rest of the samurai were hiding. Rook updated the men and let them know that they would now fulfill their promise to Tinfist. Valamon was next. Once that was completed, they would have the cooperation of the anti-slavers and launch an all-out war with the United Cities. They traveled north into the crags, where they previously located a Reaver camp. Rook didn't know where Valamon was located, so they would search all around and slaughter the slavers that dwelled in the valley. They arrived a few hours before sunrise and took advantage of the darkness of the night. No one ever expected steel-clad samurai to be as stealthy as the Liberators. When the men were in position, Rook ordered the rangers to attack the gate guards, tricking them to draw them out. As they lined up, the Reaver soldiers spotted the crossbows arming and ran towards them. Only one of the Reavers got in melee range. Before he was able to strike, a final shot blitzed him in the chest and the rest of the Liberator forces charged onto him. As he was crushed by the force of the men and collapsing to the ground, the samurai left out a battle cry and charged towards the camp. A few more soldiers came out to witness the chaos. There weren't enough Reavers to stop them from flooding into the base, spreading out and killing any hostile Reaver they could find. Their base wasn't densely populated and Rook's men overpowered them quickly. As the sun finally started to rise, Rook saw all the slaves left in cages. He would personally unlock every cage if he had to. Rook was quick with his hands, but there are so many of them, it would still take him at least a few hours to de-shackle the broken. Tao tried his hand at helping, but he wasn't very good at it. While they were trying to release the remaining slaves, the Reavers turned to slaying the defenseless escapees. A samurai came out and confronted the Reaver soldiers. It was another quick and bloody skirmish, and they took out the final one, who was trying to kill the escaped slave with his final breath, as if he couldn't fathom kindness even in death. Rook tended to the wound of the free slave and sent him on his way. They were welcome to join the Liberators, but they wanted to take their chances without Rook's men, hoping to find their way back home right away. Any surviving Reavers were scooped up and locked into empty cages, left to suffer the same fate of their victims. One of the camps went to ashes, and they continued deeper into Reaver territory, looking for their main base. Another camp was close by. This one looked bigger than the first, but it would definitely be manageable. They didn't have the cover of the night, but they still could take advantage of the Reavers' lack of training. Their crossbow, the Eagle's Cross, had a very long range and packed quite a punch when it hit. Many Reavers had their organs torn or limbs blown off before they could swing a blade. Before they got remotely close, the rest of the soldiers charged in and cut them down. Tao led the charge inside and they spread out again. The clashing of blades felt like it could be heard from the hub. While this was going on, Rook found many more slaves that needed to be freed. He could count on his men to take out the rest of the Reavers here, and he continued to work at it single-handedly. The men were grateful, but didn't want to follow the Liberators either. Instead, they looted the bodies of the Reavers and left in the direction that the Liberators came from, praying that any threat further south was already taken care of by Rook's force. Another camp crushed by the force of the Liberators. Now on to the next. As they continued traveling, they located a nearby settlement called Ark. Rook changed their course to Ark to investigate. They arrived at the outskirts of Ark and saw a huge building off in the distance. Rook had a feeling that this was it. He told his men to stay back while he snuck inside to investigate, and if anything suspicious happens while he's in there, to launch a full attack. The closer Rook got, the more Reaver men he saw patrolling the outside of the building. This had to be it. He crept up the ramp to the structure and saw it was a massive facility. There were slave cages everywhere. He suspected there would be a lot of people to free. There was also a throne room, but no one was sitting on the throne. Valamon had to be here. Rook also noted there was a pretty suspicious-looking safe behind the throne, and in classic Rook fashion, he just couldn't help himself. He tried sneaking past a large open room that was well lit and surrounded by men. And he almost did it too. He snuck all the way up to the safe before someone screamed out that there was an intruder and approached him. In the heat of the moment, Rook didn't even seem to care. He was so focused on opening the safe. As he cracked the code and almost opened it, Reaver scum were beating him down with their hacking tools. Rook turned and faced them. His powerful swing took 3 of them in one go, but more and more men continued pouring in. Rook continued cutting men down, but not without them trading a few blows to Rook. At this point, he was considered one of the strongest fighters in the land, but even he had his limits. He was caught in a bad position that allowed him to get completely surrounded, and he couldn't defend himself from all angles. Fortunately, the rest of the Liberators heard the commotion that Rook caused and proceeded to engage. As they were approaching, Rook continued to hold his ground as best as he could. He let out a sigh of relief when Tal sprinted into the room and caught the attention of the bulk of the enemy reinforcements. The other samurai entered to hold a line. In the midst of the chaos, Rook took the opportunity to bandage himself and then continued the fight until they found Valamon. He realized that they were overwhelming the Reaver forces and started freeing the slaves so they could steal back from their captors and run. The majority of the fighting led outside, but funnily enough, as Rook led the newly freed slaves into the throne room to get equipment before they escaped, he passed by a wounded Reaver, indistinguishable from the others, Valamon. There was an awkward moment where the two of them stared at each other briefly and realized who each of them were, and they drew their blades. They began trading blows, and even though Valamon was already severely wounded, he was holding his own against Rook. It was an intense duel until Sparta came from around the corner, leapt into the air, and launched his knee into Valamon's temple from his blind spot, knocking him completely out. Rook claimed his Mate 2 grade longsword for himself, which was a very fine sidearm to have, then stripped him of the rest of his belongings for the freed slaves to have. At this point, Valamon was critically injured and the vast majority of the remaining Reaver forces were destroyed. Rook threw Valamon into one of his own cells and locked it to be forgotten. The only people left were the few remaining slaves grabbing as much loot as they could before departing. Just like the Southern Hive and the Skin Bandits before, the Reavers would no longer be a threat to Tinfist or anyone else. It was now time for them to return to Tinfist. They left Ark in a state of disarray, and any Reaver that remained wouldn't have anywhere left to go or anyone to report to. Rook met up with the rest of the men and they quickly returned to Spring. Rook had everyone wait outside as he went in to meet with Tinfist. It's done. My end of the bargain's complete. Now the question is, are you ready to hold up your end of the deal?
I knew you had it in you, Rook. And with such efficiency, too. Yes, I will indeed hold up my end of the bargain. My men are ready and in position to strike. Once you begin your assault, we'll ensure that any reinforcements or war supplies that they send are cut off and stopped. If you can take down the nobles that run each united city, Tengu's forces will weaken and deplete until they're nothing but a husk of their former selves. When that happens, I'll even let you have the honor of killing Tengu.
Good. We'll begin our march now. I know the perfect location to hit first.
Farewell, Rook, and good luck.
After everything they prepared for and everything they had to do to lead up to this point, it was finally time to wage war against the slavers in the United Cities. Their first target would be where this all began, eye socket. Everyone was anxious but prepared, especially Rook. All of the killing and destruction left in his wake would soon pay off, but first, who was behind it all had to go down. They arrived outside of eye socket in the evening. The liberation was about to begin. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I want to give a big thanks to my editor, Logan S., who is helping me with making more engaging content for you to enjoy. And a special thanks to all my patrons who are helping support the channel. I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and until next time, have a good one.